Let's continue our overview or review of macroeconomics. You see before you a demand curve. Now, hopefully, you remember how to draw demand curves, but if not, let's quickly go over it. If you think about all of the factors that influence how much of a good you wish to purchase, let's say we're talking about bottled water. What factors would influence how much bottled water you would want to demand in a month? Your income, the weather, the price and availability of soda, the price and availability of pretzels, all sorts of factors could influence the amount of bottled water you would choose to purchase. Remember, we use that Latin phrase, ceteris paribus. It simply means hold everything constant, and we let one thing change. When we draw a demand curve, the one thing we allow to change is price. We argue that price is the signaling mechanism of the economy. It tells consumers how much to buy, it tells producers how much to make. So in this case, we're looking at a consumer. And we're saying if price goes from $5 to $2.50 to $1 to 50 cents to 25 cents, what's going to happen to demand? And so we know that as price goes down, consumers are going to want to buy more of it. This is the law of demand. The law of demand tells us that there is a negative relationship between price and quantity. That negative relationship, if we graph it, at $5, you don't want any. At $2.50, you want one. At $1, you want five. At 50 cents, you want eight. This is what you're seeing. That's how you get the demand curve. It's this negative relationship between price and quantity. Now, the flip side of that discussion is supply. Consumers demand, producers supply. So now, if you're the producer of bottled water, what factors are going to influence the amount of bottled water you would wish to supply? Well, again, there are thousands of factors that will influence the amount of bottled water you would wish to supply. Can't look at all of them at once. Ceteris paribus, hold everything constant. In this case, we're going to hold everything constant but allow price to change. Again, price being that signaling mechanism. So the market yells out a price and producers decide how much they're going to produce. So again, we see prices dropping, but now what happens to supply? As price goes down, the incentive to produce goes down, so producers make less of the good. This is the law of supply. The law of supply tells us that there is a positive relationship between the price of a good and the amount of a good producers willing to supply. So we see that positive relationship with a positively sloped curve, an upward sloping curve. Now, at 25 cents, we want one. At 50 cents, we want three. At $1, we want five. So that's what we're doing. We're just plotting these coordinates, and we get this supply curve. Now, in a market, and remember, a market is simply a place where buyers and sellers come together. How do we bring these two together? And so we bring our supply curve and our demand curve together into one pair of axes. Please note, when drawing graphs in economics, you should always label the axes so you know what you're measuring along them. And also, please label every line that you draw, every graph that you draw in the space, so it's very clear what you're doing. Okay, so what we're seeing here is A market for, let's stick with bottled water. This is the market for bottled water. We've allowed price to change. We see what happens to demand. We let price change. We see what happens to supply. We put them together and now we have a market. If the market is free to adjust, it will go to equilibrium. Equilibrium is defined as a point at which there is no force moving you to change. So in this picture, equilibrium is the place where supply equals demand. If producers are making exactly what consumers want to buy, then there's no force in having either the producer or the consumer change what they're doing. This is a good point for both. So in this picture, we can see we have an equilibrium price, and PE, whether it's a subscript or a superscript, PE will always represent equilibrium price. QE will always represent equilibrium quantity. So at the point where supply equals demand, we can determine an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. All right. Now, it's one of the reasons why traditional economists have always liked what we call a laissez-faire market. A laissez-faire market is one in which there's no government intervention, where just market forces rule, and so the market can adjust. So let's take a look at how the market would adjust. If this is our original demand curve, I'm labeling it demand 1. This is our original curve. Remember, when we originally drew the demand curve, we held everything constant. But that's not realistic because things change in the market. So we have to be able to show those changes on our graph. If price were to change, let's say we started at point A. There was a price at point A and a quantity at point A. Well, if the price of bottled water drops to point B, right, then we can see we went from price A to price B, and now instead of wanting QA, we want QB of the good, right? So moving from point A to point B is due to a change in price. And we call that movement along the curve. Movement along the curve is staying on the same curve, but just changing location. Movement always occurs because of a change in price. Now, let's be realistic. There are lots of factors which will influence your demand for a good. And they can change. For example, your income. If your income goes up, you're going to demand more of the good. Now, if you're allowing your income to change, price has to stay the same. Again, it's that ceteris paribus thing. We only let one thing change at a time. All right, so if we start at point A and at price A, but now income goes up, and we know we want more of the good, but price has to stay the same. To show more, we have to move out. So we would be here. If we had been at point B, price stays the same, but income goes up, we would have to shift outward to the other curve. And so if anything other than price changes, we have a shift of the curve. A shift of the curve means that the entire curve changes location. The entire curve moves. And that's due to anything other than price. Now, a shift outward, like we're seeing here, represents an increase in demand. If something were to happen and demand would drop, there would be a shift inward or to the left, and that would represent a decrease in demand. Now, please understand that there are shifts and movements along the supply curve, and but I just don't want to take the time here to look at those right now. Now, sometimes, and I know we mentioned this already, there are times when, as an economist, theory tells me one thing. But as a human being, as a person in my society, I don't want to do that. I need to do something else. Using equilibrium, we can see an instance in which what is a person in society that I want to do will be different than what economic theory tells me. For example, if we use this graph, we can see that there's an equilibrium quantity and an equilibrium price. Now, let's say this is the market for rice, and rice is a staple of our diet. This, as a society, we may decide is too high of a price for most people to afford. So we impose, as a government, we impose what we call a price ceiling. Remember, a price ceiling is the maximum price you can charge for a good. Now, if we force producers to charge an artificially low price, moving from equilibrium to the price ceiling, saying this is the maximum amount you can charge, this green line is going to give us some information. At this artificially low price, how much is going to be demanded? Well, we know if price goes down, quantity demanded is going to go up. So take this line over to the demand curve and read the quantity demanded off the axis. So demand has gone up from QE to QD. At this artificially low price, what happens to supply? Well, if you go over to the supply curve and you read the quantity off, we see that supply has dropped. And now we have a problem. Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and so we have a shortage of a good. Price ceiling is going to cause a shortage. While some people can still get the good and they're getting it at a lower price, fewer people now are able to get the good. The other side of this coin is, what happens if this is the market for labor and our equilibrium price for labor is $5 an hour? Who can live on $5 an hour? So the government imposes what we call a price floor. A price floor, an example of a price floor are minimum wages. A price floor is defined as the legal minimum that you can pay for a good. It's just like minimum wages, you can't pay anyone less than this. Now, when the government imposes an artificially high price, what impact does that have on the economy? Well, at this price, you go over to the demand curve and you read the quantity demanded. As price goes up, we see quantity demanded has dropped. At this artificially high price, what happens to supply? Well, they go over to the supply curve, read the quantity supplied, and look what happens. Quantity supplied has gone up. Sure, the price you can sell the good goes up. Producers want to make more. But this leaves us with a problem. Quantity supplied is much higher than quantity demanded. We have a surplus of the good. And that's a problem. When the government intervenes and set prices other than equilibrium prices, we're either going to have a surplus or we're going to have a shortage. And that's going to be another problem in society that we're going to have to deal with. So keep that in mind. Here's the end of our overview of macro. Our next lecture will take us into micro.